right, everyone. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the F Yeah podcast, Flatirons Young Adults. We are so excited for today's episode. We are joined by Jesse DeYoung. Jesse, thanks so much for being here, man.
Dude, love it. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Hey, would you just real quick, for anybody who's listening, may not know your voice, will you just give us a quick lowdown, who you are, your relationship with Flatirons, how you got involved in ministry, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. No, that's great. I was born into a ministry family. My dad was a pastor. And so kind of a weird story. I kind of knew that ministry, full-time ministry was something I wanted to do since I was 15. And so been kind of pursuing that path, Bible college, different places. Jim actually was my youth pastor. So growing up. So
that's right. Oh yeah. I knew that. Okay.
My wife, Karen, she's part of the story too. She and I met when we were 16 in Jim's youth group. And then we dated through college, got married. And so now we got 4 kids, ages 14 down to 7. And Karen and I have been married for 17 years, and we've been out in Colorado at Flatirons for 11.
It's awesome, man. Yeah, Jesse's our executive pastor here at Flatirons. If you attend church around here, you've heard Jesse teach. He is awesome. I had no idea you met your wife in youth group.
Bro, high school sweethearts.
Let's go, man. That's amazing. I feel like
I tell my kids, I want to tell them like, hey, you're not going to marry this person. It's okay. But I'm like, you might. Give it like 2 years and this could be the person that they married.
I feel like you got to go to student ministries and like use that as a pitch.
Find that person.
Like, hey, you never know.
You never
know. I feel like that's normally the angle that a lot of young adult ministries try to spin is come find your person, but maybe youth group. No, man, we're so excited you're here. And today we're going to open up a conversation around leadership, and specifically leadership as it pertains to masculinity.
Sure.
So a huge part of my story is I grew up in a really conservative private Christian school.
Yep.
And I think anybody maybe who has been around church or in church or going to church has had some sort of ideology placed on them as far as men in leadership.
Sure.
And what that means. I feel like I have gotten so many different definitions. I know growing up for a huge part of my life, I looked at men in leadership and I went, I don't even know what that means.
Sure.
I've just been told, hey, because you're a man, the Bible says you're supposed to lead. So kind of starting off, if you could kind of just give us like a high level view, maybe even introduce us to maybe a little of your story around that, of, hey, how have you kind of wrestled with what it means to kind of marry those two things of masculinity and leadership. And then from there, just kind of talk to us about what you've learned. Like, what does it actually mean in a healthy way to marry masculinity and leadership to one another?
Man, that's great. That's great. I feel like they're so connected for me, and I forget where I heard part of this, but for me, masculinity is willingly accepting responsibility. So willingly accepting responsibility. If you look at the fall, you look at Adam, what's the first thing Adam does after the fall?
Yeah.
Like he blames Eve. He gives all the excuses. And that's what like boys do. Boys make excuses. I've got 2 boys, one is 7 and one is 12. And like regularly they're like, Dad, I was playing Fortnite and I couldn't hear you, like with my headset. And I'm like, and I understand it. But at the same time, like a man takes responsibility, says, yeah, that's on me. And I feel like a good leader does that as well. I feel like there's been so many bad examples of male leadership in the past, like from men in leadership wear suits, they don't let anybody see their flaws. They act like they've never made a mistake in their life. And so I go like, that's what some bad male leadership has looked like. Yeah. But I feel like for me, if I'm looking at my home life, if I'm looking at my personal life, if I'm looking at the way I raise my kids, if I'm looking at work, am I willingly accepting responsibility, even like gladly? Like the more responsibility I'm put in, to provide for my family, to protect my family, to raise my kids, to disciple my kids, to cherish my wife. If I have that responsibility and I'm not shirking away from it, or I'm not trying to like fill my time with numbing or hobbies or whatever, and I'm just saying like, no, I'm going to willingly accept this responsibility. I think that that's the essence of masculinity, but I also feel like it's part of the essence of leadership as well.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, even just giving that definition, willingly accepting responsibility, I feel like that is something that, because when I think masculine leadership, a lot of times I think of exactly what you were saying. How does that look on the surface?
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
To me, I think I have to be the first to speak. It means you have to be in charge. It means you have to be domineering. But I think what you're saying is, hey, this is like accepting responsibility becomes a humble thing at that point.
Sure.
A willingness to accept responsibility does not mean that you're doing things to necessarily make sure your agenda is known or that you are putting yourself in a position to be seen or heard or followed. but you're just saying, hey, what is the thing that I need to take ownership of and continue on from there?
The guy with the bravado or six his chest out or whatever that is, like, think about all the times that guy in work or home, he does not admit that he's wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
He makes excuses for why he doesn't have what he wants or why people didn't do what they were supposed to do. Yeah. Like, he doesn't take responsibility. And the best leaders, Jim Collins talks about level 5 leaders, and he looks at these great companies that went from, in his book, good to great, but he looks at these companies and he's like, the leaders weren't the ones that are the tallest, most muscular. They've got a full head of hair, I wish I had that, but like,
there's a lot of balding men at this church.
Cards. And so I don't know. I guess we can't work at other churches. I go to some churches, I'm like, how does everyone here have hair? I don't understand it. But I just think about those guys, how often they make excuses, how often they blame other people, how often they act like it should be all about them. And then you look at men or women who are what Collins would call level 5 leaders. And they're the ones who walk in with humility, who still are diligent, who still like hold people accountable. But at the same time, they have a ton of humility, but they're accepting responsibility for everything that's happening and not just the things that go right and then blaming others for the things that go wrong.
Well, and what I hear you saying too, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, I'm hearing leadership is more character than it is gifting. Because I think a lot of time too, when I think of leaders, I mean, I'm thinking of quarterbacks, I'm thinking of athletes, of CEOs, and there's times where I can look at, I think what I would, in my head, when I hear leader, the first thing I'm associating with is someone who has a really, really great skill set, like yourself or Jim, for example. And it's like, Jim's got this incredible ability to communicate. And I go, okay, does that mean that I'm not a leader if I can't communicate? But what I hear you saying is it's so much more about character. Am I getting that right?
100%. Like, you need a skill set to be like, you don't want to hit your lid in an organization or in a job where it's like, man, you've outpunted your coverage and you really are like, man, I don't have the skills to do this job. So skills are important, but skills really are only going to carry the day for maybe a year or two. You look at for instance, a hotshot quarterback who comes in, who doesn't have character, who doesn't have humility, and they come in and like, man, there's a ton of hype, like they might have a catchphrase or whatever that looks like, but at the same time, you appreciate that.
Won't mention it, but yep.
At the same time, it's like their character has not caught up to their skill set. And so it's like, man, if you don't have character to match your skill set, eventually people are going to give up on you. Sometimes it's so quick. Sometimes you just look at any of the quarterbacks in the NFL or wide receivers in the NFL who don't have character. And it's like, people will put up with you as long as you're producing. But the moment you stop producing, they're not going to put up with you. And like what I've seen, especially when it comes to leadership, is your skill set, you'll work on it. And it might overnight, you might become successful with your skills. It might take 4 or 5 years of working on them, and then all of a sudden you just get all this opportunity. Character is not like that. Character is this thing where you can just add the same amount of character with effort year after year after year. And so it's that thing that you have to consistently be building so that it's prepared for whenever your skill set ramps up. Because again, if your skill set or your leadership outpaces your character, you're going to put yourself in terrible situations where you might look great on the outside, but at the same time, the people who are closest to you, they're not going to respect you. They're not going to want to be around you. And ultimately, you're going to go like, why am I even leading right now if the people I care about the most don't respect me?
Yeah, or it sounds like it'd just be miserable or unsustainable to an extent too.
Sure.
So obviously you're talking about this from a standpoint of, I mean, you're dropping so many golden nuggets right now, but I think you're also speaking from this from a place of experience. I'd love to hear for you, I mean, what has your leadership journey been like? I mean, I know you mentioned kind of earlier, you had a story where you realized, hey, leadership's not easy. It's difficult.
Sure.
I mean, I'd love to hear this. Was that more of a professional thing? Was that something in the home? Was it both?
I was a terrible, let's not talk about home. Home is where I have so much room to grow. Carol would affirm it. And we're working on that constantly. And as our kids are changing ages and all that, it's just, there's constant adjustment. I was a very bad young leader. That's why I'm so passionate about what you guys are doing when it comes to young adults and young leaders, young professionals, is my dad was in a similar role at the church I grew up with, and he was just brilliant and my mentor, a hero. And so Dad and I would spend any vacation, we would just talk leadership, talk Bible, talk church, all this stuff. Just loved it. And then my first job, I went to a place, and I remember Those guys, for a church of, I think, like 1,500 folks, which is a big church, they were guys who had led a church to be 1,500 folks. And at the same time, and I would tell this to them today, my dad was a better leader than them. And so the conversations that I was having at the time, I was like, I would rather just go talk to my dad than have any conversation with them. And I looked at them in a way where I was like, I have nothing to learn from you. And that's something that I think young adults do so often. At least what I found when I was a young adult is I was like cherry picking people to learn from and not looking at everyone like there is something to learn there. And I just remember I was I would call it dishonoring in that time where, like, even though I wasn't trying to be, those people knew I didn't want to learn from them. You know, those people knew I didn't really have that much respect or admiration for them, and they could just feel that in my presence. And that's one of those things where I look back on it, and Christian, I just go like, man, I remember having a conversation my last day of work. I was going somewhere else, and my boss pulled me in, and he was just like, he asked me a question and I responded, and I didn't have a great answer in my response. And I was like, man, that's hard. And he goes, yeah, it is hard, isn't it? And in the moment I had two thoughts. Number one, this is probably, his job's harder than I think that it is. Like his job, there are things about it that I don't understand. But two, hard is what you sign up for when you sign up to be a leader. You know, like people who think that leadership is simply just telling other people what to do. Hey, I've got this idea, go make it happen. Like that's not what leadership is. Leadership is actually accepting more responsibility. You just go like, do you want to be responsible for 100 people who are providing for their families? Do you want to be responsible for 100 people's kids having Christmas or not? Like leadership is hard. And that taught me like, every person's job is harder than I think that it is, especially the further up in an organization. I mean, this was the senior pastor of our church. His job was way harder than I thought it was. And I thought I could do his job. Like I honestly thought like I could do his job better than he could. And like maybe one or two things I could have done better, but I could have never at that age held the weight and carried the weight that he was carrying of all those people.
Wow, man. I'm sitting here like taking all that internet into and processing it of like so many things you said I think are so true, and I think I fall prey to them a lot. Where a lot of times, and this is what I love about the millennial generation specifically, and being a young adult in that world. We have so much passion and so much zeal, and there's an aspect of it where I think we get so fired up, or at least I do, within our passion, that we end up looking towards every potential thing that we could want to do with our lives and say, man, I could do that. But what I hear you saying is, hey, the higher you climb that ladder, for lack of a better term, there's a whole nother side, a whole nother war that you're not seeing that's got to be fought. And to your point, it's more about focusing on developing your character to handle that responsibility than you're not seeing, rather than going and doing the things that you are seeing on the surface, which is huge.
I want you to think about any insecure leader who you've worked for before. And like working for an insecure leader is the worst leader to work for. Does that make sense? Because they're going to make everything about them. Anything that you do well, they're actually going to take as a value statement on them. They're going to push that down. Insecurity is a character flaw. Now, it's something that we all wrestle with. You know, I wrestle with insecurity so often, but at the same time, like, that's not what God called us to. That's actually something that we could work on. It is a character issue that, like, when we identify it, we actually need to work through it. And again, if you're a leader and you're insecure and you're not working on that part of your character, it's going to come out on your peers. It's going to come out on the people you lead. It's going to come out on the people who are leading you as well.
Well, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but it also sounds to an extent exhausting, where it constantly feels like, again, if your character maybe is not caught up to that point of your skill set, you're constantly trying to maintain the image that it has. And I feel like I've been in seasons of my life where that's happened, and it's the most draining and exhausting thing in the world.
And it's like, I have no judgment, you know, like it might be a harsh word, but no judgment, because it's like, there have been seasons when I stepped into this role 2 years ago, like wrestling with a lot of insecurity. But again, like me getting better at my job wasn't going to make me feel more secure. Like maybe a little bit, but really it's wrestling with, who did God create me to be? Does God say that I am? And then like, after that, what are the things that I need to work on so that I can be a better leader and do better in my job? But ultimately, it comes back to, do I believe what God says about me in this specific place? And that's the character issue.
So you're saying it comes more so down to identity at that point?
I really think so. I really think that it's an identity in Jesus expressed in the role that you have right now and how those things marry up. And like, obviously all of us have plenty to work on to improve, but at the same time, like, I know people, Christian, my story is like, I had around going to, it made me actually go to Crucible or these liminal retreats that we do, but it was like I was so deeply insecure, and at the same time I was adding to my skill set every single day. It was like listening to another podcast, read another book, asking for feedback, employing the feedback, and at the same time, like, it still didn't like root out this insecurity that I was dealing with, because it was this identity piece. And so like, there is that character of believing what God says. And then I'm not saying like believing God says that you're a great leader and never work on it, you know, like you really do need to work on it. But at the same time, you can work on it all that you want. And if you're not believing what God says about you is true, like, that stuff doesn't matter.
Dude, I love that you said that, because that rings so true for me. And I think it's actually what makes modeling leadership and modeling masculinity after Jesus and his teachings so countercultural. Because to go back to the athlete analogy, and I do this, like, I probably did this in my head today. Every time I think about my job, or I need to get better as a husband or whatever, I start thinking on, how do I sharpen my skill set? Because I'm thinking like an athlete at a bad game. Okay, so I need to go in the gym and get X number of shots up. I need to get in the weight room and get stronger. And what I hear you saying is like, hey, that will add to your skill set, but it's not actually going to fix the core issue. You have to actually address this in a different manner. And I just feel like it's not a message that our culture is really getting across to young men and women. Hey, develop your skill set, not develop your character. And to an extent, what I hear you saying is like being able to find peace with yourself. And the only way that you're able to actually do that is to actually grow in a relationship with Jesus. And kind of unpacking that, since we're kind of on this topic of insecurity, I mean, I hear that and I go, that's my pain point in any form of leadership in my life, whether it's as a husband, here at Flatirons, in my friendship circles. The biggest thing I feel like I deal with is I'm insecure. I shouldn't be here. And so I always feel like I'm trying to prove, hey, I'm this level of leader. Maybe in your own story, or for any young adult who's listening, specifically maybe the young men who are listening, who are saying, hey, I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a godly man and lead my girlfriend or lead my fiance, or hey, I'm stepping into my career and I'm trying to grow in leadership, and we're all dealing with insecurity. How would you advise or speak to or encourage young adults who are dealing with that? How would you deal with that yourself? And how would you encourage us to lean into healing when it comes to some of that insecurity and really taking that path?
Sure. I think that, and I'm not sure, I'll just speak to when I was a young adult. I had I was trying to prove myself to a lot of people. Like, I was using leadership. I was using ministry and pastoring and preaching to prove myself to my dad, to prove myself to kids in high school who they didn't care about me. You know, they weren't even thinking about me, but I'm trying to prove like, man, people like me, I'll be successful. Dad, I want you to be impressed with me. And these things that like, and so I think that there are these core messages that I wish I would have identified earlier. And like, one thing that has been so helpful for me, I'm sure you guys have talked about it before, but the liminal retreats that they do, the unknown journey in, I think, is it Unleashed? Is that the one for the ladies? For the ladies. So Unleashed, those two, they're so helpful in identifying some of these messages that are driving us and not like enticing us, pulling us forward, but they're really like driving us and whipping us in the back. That was one of the things that I worked on that I wish I would have been able to work on sooner. I also, honor is such a huge thing for that I didn't, when I was a young leader, I did not honor the people. To go back to that story beforehand, I assumed I had nothing to learn. There's a way, like, people can feel when you don't honor them. We live in a culture of dishonor, which is just kind of like, you share, like, disagreement is common, you know, saying people are idiots, you know, like whatever that is, like the other side is vilifying each other. And I think we've been taught to do that all the way across the board, but especially with leaders, where it's just like, we're going to point out all of your flaws. And I really think the things to work on when it comes to like character and, this doesn't really have to do too much with insecurity, but it really is like, I'm going to honor you for the weight that you carry. I'm going to honor you for the role that you're in. I'm going to honor you for the person that you are, and everything else. Any reason that I don't do that, that's actually about me. Does that make sense? Like, I was an insecure leader, so I had to point out the insecurities in others. I had to point out the insecurities or the deficiencies in my bosses or people that I work with. That was my insecurity. And so I really believe that honor is one of the ways that we can just treat people as uncommon, treat people like you have something to learn from them, that you have something to gain from being around them. And it helps us actually heal our own insecurity simply because it's like, hey, I'm going to treat you different. I'm going to step into being the kind of a person who treats other people as uncommon rather than being the kind of person who treats other people like I'm better than you to make up for my own insecurity. Does that make sense?
100%. What I hear you saying is it's almost being a little countercultural to the dog-eat-dog world of it's not about necessarily trampling over people to get what you want, but rather trying to get there by creating a system of honor where you're actually seeing the people around you, honoring them for who you are, and then in turn trying to create a culture where that happens back to you. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, and I would say, like, just as you were sharing that, I think people are either people of dishonor or we look at them as butt kissers, which is just like all they're doing is like sucking up to the boss and telling them everything's great and all that. And none of us want to be that. But I think the tension is then we just go into being a person of dishonor. I don't want to be known as somebody who's a kiss up. So instead I'm going to I'm actually going to resist their leadership. When in reality, you got to find this medium where it's like, man, I don't want to just tell them, like, again, it's not honoring if I don't tell you your fly's down. Like, sure. That's not honoring. I need to tell you your fly's down. And so that's part of it. There's this honesty that goes with it, but also there's this like, hey, I'm for you and I'm going to do what's in my power to help you do a good job. Because like, dude, I remember the meeting that I had where I was just sitting there, like I sucked leading this meeting with my team. Like I was just like, this sucks. This is not good. They're not responding. And I was thinking about these two guys who were just leaning out and just like acting like, why do we have to be there? I don't know if that's what they were thinking. They might have had a bad, morning. They might need to go to the bathroom. I don't really know. But in my head as the leader, I'm thinking like, no one wants to be here. And what was so interesting is when those two guys at different times stepped off the team and somebody else came in who was leaning in and just taking notes as I was talking and giving me a little bit of nonverbals, I started leading better just because I was like, oh, they're leaning in. It had nothing to do with my leadership one way or another. Does that make sense? Like there's the frailty of going, I'm letting people's response dictate how I lead. I wish I had led better through that. But in reality, I wasn't leading differently. People were responding to my leadership differently. And it changed the effectiveness. And so that's what I believe that honor is. Honor is going like, man, Christian, if I work for you, I want to help you do a great job. I want to help you have confidence in the job that you're doing. And like, I see it in the Old Testament. I think it's 2 Samuel, maybe 22, but David's complaining. David's in a low. He's in a cave. And he just says like, man, I just wish I could drink from the well in Jerusalem. And maybe you know the story. And so two of his guys break through Philistine lines to go get him some water from Jerusalem, as if to say like, David, it might be ridiculous that you think you need that, but we believe in you. You're God's man for this time. So we're going to do something extraordinary for you so that you can have confidence to lead us. And then what I love about David that I don't think we see too much in today's culture too, is that David actually pours out the water, which they're kind of like, hey bro, we risked our life to get you this water. But at the same time, David is saying, hey, I appreciate this, but I don't need honor. If you need honor, that's actually a dangerous thing. Giving honor is a powerful thing. Needing honor is a dangerous thing. And I think you see that dynamic in that story.
Wow, man, that's powerful. Gosh, I got so many questions in my head I want to ask you. But okay, so coming out of this place of honor, like kind of what I hear you saying in that is, to an extent, if you want to grow into becoming a good leader, at first that means you almost need to work on being a really good follower.
Sure.
That's kind of what I hear you saying in that of like, because to me, my head instantaneously goes to, and I don't know if you'd say this is true or not, those individuals that are leaning into your meetings are probably the ones that are going to become the better leaders going forward.
Without a
because
doubt.
They knew how to honor a leader before they ever stepped into a position of leadership.
Because they're able to see what somebody, like how their actions impact other people. The worst leaders you work for are people, they don't see how their actions are impacting the people below them. Does that make sense? So when you're a follower working for someone, you see how your actions are actually impacting the person that you're following.
Yeah.
That's actually the making of a great leader, because you're learning, hey, I have a responsibility for my impact on people, whether I'm leading them or I'm following them. That's what honor is.
Powerful. And I'm curious too, kind of to maybe break this down into more context that a lot of our listeners, a lot of young adult men, myself included, would find themselves in. Practically, how do I do that? So as someone who is, and I would assume this is very true for a lot of young adult men specifically, we are both leading and following in this stage of our lives.
Sure.
Maybe both at work, and then I think another huge pain point that there's so many questions around is it really is in our relationships and our relationships with women.
Sure.
How do we do that? How do we lead in honor, yet also maybe in our professional circles, how do we honor the leaders that we are behind? And maybe the tricky question is even if we might not feel like we want to honor them.
Sure.
I mean, how do we embody that? Because I hear that in principle, I'm like, let's go. And I'm thinking about my relationship with my wife, Emma. I'm thinking back to our days when we were dating, our days when we were engaged. I'm thinking about my life here. And I go, how do I step into doing that?
Sure.
Like, accepting responsibility, I can get behind that
Yep.
one of like, I understand that it means I'm not making excuses. It means when I go home, I'm not pointing the fingers. It's between me and Emma. It's saying, what am I in charge of to make sure that you flourish? And that's my responsibility. But when I think of really just practically stepping into that honor cycle, besides just saying something kind, okay, you're doing a great job.
Sure.
How would you encourage young adults practically, and men specifically, even just to practically step into that culture of honor and maybe some of the context they're finding themselves?
Yeah, I think, because again, what do you do with dishonorable people? Does that make sense? Like that, and that's a good question. I think, first of all, like if the president of the United States walked in this room, I'm standing up. Doesn't matter if I agree or disagree with whatever president, former president, anything. I stand up. Why? Because of the office, because of the weight that he's carried. And so I think that, like, first of all, honor looks at the weight that somebody's carrying and the office that they hold, the position, and say, I am honoring you because you hold that position, even if I don't think you're doing it that great, even though if I disagree, but at the same time, that position requires more from you than I understand. And so there's this generous empathy that goes out. So I think it's a mindset thing first to go like, there's this generous empathy that you're carrying more than I can see that you're carrying. You're carrying more than I think that you are. So I'm going to honor you for that. And then the other way is just practically going like, I want to, and honor really is about me, not about the other person. It's about my attitude, my mindset, not the other person. But for me, I think about it and I just go like, I'm going to treat you as if you're on your best day. How would I want to treat you on your best day? And I'm not going to let your behavior dictate how I treat you. Does sometimes this cause people, like, they don't learn from it, they don't grow from it, people who are being honored and they accept it, they need it? Like, yeah, probably. But at the same time, honor is not about that person. Honor is about us. Honor is about our attitude. And so I think it's a mindset and an attitude thing. Some practical ways to do it is just like, I think for every criticism that you bring, you should bring 5 encouragements or compliments. You know, they need to know, like, and this is true for me and Jim. It's just kind of like, Jim needs to know that I'm for him. I don't want Jim feeling like I'm against him. The same way for him toward me. Yeah. He's going to encourage me so much more than he challenges, questions, or critiques. And we do plenty of that. But at the same time, if I'm critiquing you from a place that we're not connected and you don't feel like I'm for you, like your defenses go up immediately compared to if I'm encouraging you, you know that I'm for you, that I'm on your side, so that when I bring some feedback or criticism, you're like, hey, Jesse loves me, trusts me, is for me, so I can do that. So I think encouragement really is a huge one. I honestly think the way that we ask questions is a big one too. Like,
what do you mean by that?
I think that when you talk about, there are ways to ask questions that are actually dishonoring. Like, one of my favorite questions is, help me understand. You know, hey, help me understand this. There's a way to ask, help me understand. Hey, Christian, help me understand how you could be so stupid as to make a decision. And there's a way where somebody can ask that question in a way and in a spirit and in a tone that makes you get defensive immediately. And then there's a way of like asking a question that's just like, hey, and this is one of the things that I really had to learn, because I ask questions that way. Like, anytime I'd ask a question, it was kind of like, I know what's right. I think you're wrong. So I'm asking you a question to prove you wrong, instead of going, okay, this person that I'm talking to, I'm actually going to tell myself they know something I don't know. They're actually right and I'm wrong. I need to find out what they know. And so I'm going to ask a question in a way that's curious and not just trying to prove a point. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It's almost, what I hear you saying is it's, to an extent, it's putting yourself in the shoes of another person. And again, this is like the cliche thing, but it's like you're asking them a question based on how you'd want that question to be asked to you.
Yep.
Taking the human being in mind and seeing the human being within it. And I hear what you're saying in that, because now it's really starting to click for me. And I hope it's the same for anybody who's listening, where honor comes full circle essentially when you feel honored, when you feel seen for who you are and what you do. And I think that is such a key principle for us to hold on to and lean into. As you said, we live in a culture of dishonor.
Sure.
In a culture that is not about necessarily seeing people.
It's just about being heard. Yeah. It's not trying to see people. Yeah. It's just trying to be heard.
That's what I was saying. That's it. I think we claim that we do that, but specifically probably in working context, professional context, it's more so about getting results in so many ways than it is actually being able to see people. And that's the thing I think I love the most about Jesus is, regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with what he said, what he taught, he always saw people for who they were. And that was always a value statement for him. Sure. Like every single time it was, hey, no matter what truth I'm going to deliver to you or encouragement or whatever, there was always this essence about him in the way he conversed with people, interacted with people. He saw the full picture of who they were and their value as a human being and spoke from that place.
Yeah. And he honored people who were dishonorable. Does that make sense? Doesn't mean that he didn't speak the truth of power. Doesn't mean that he didn't say hard things or challenge people, but he honored people who even didn't deserve honor. But because again, honor says more about us than it does about the person we're honoring.
No, I love that, man. I mean, I'm in my head, I'm thinking about that in so many contexts of life. I mean, even when it comes to, again, relationships, it's like, I am so hardwired to just see what is going on the surface of somebody, whether it be here at work, whether it be in my relationship with my wife. And as I'm thinking about what would it look like to take that second and pause, because again, in this leadership conversation, there's so much ambiguity to, as a man, how do I step into leadership? I think that's a really great practical thing, is to go like, do you want to lead people well and grow in your leadership? Start seeing the humanity, the intrinsic God-wired image within them, and speak to them from that place
100%.
Versus a place of all I see is the mistake. All I see is the anger, the frustration, the surface. I mean, even when it comes to, and I'm not going to get political here, but even when it comes to people we disagree with on anything you could say is social or political, like I often find myself so many times seeing what's on the surface or scrolling through Instagram and going like instantaneously coming to a judgment about how I think or how I feel about that person. And I go, man, I would, if I was in, in a relationship with them, or if I was friends with them, I'd say this, this, and this, and I'm not taking the human aspect into account.
Sure.
And what I hear you saying, and I think that's so true too, when I felt the most valued in my life by someone who is leading me, is when they've taken the time to see the humanity of me and honor that. And I think it's such a huge thing we got to hold on to. And as men, to an extent, we say this a lot around here, leadership, you said, is accepting responsibility. It also means that we're just willing to go first.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that we have a plan and the strategy and that we're Columbus sailing the ship and we have this whole thing charted out. It just means that we're willing to take the risk and go first. I think it's a great takeaway from this conversation is, hey, if you're figuring out what does it mean to be a godly man who leads, okay, first of all, accept responsibility. Don't make excuses. Number two, be the first person to honor people in your life, whether it be your friends, the people you're working with, your girlfriend, your fiance. You want to be a man of God, honor them for the intrinsic image that God has placed within them and act out of that.
And not for what they do for you. Because that's what we do in our relationships. That's why I think honor is actually hard. And for me, in my marriage, I want to honor Kara when she has done something that's impacted me. Man, you made this great meal that I love, that I really like. We're connected, like we're connected and intimate. I appreciate you. I honor you for us being connected, but it's not honoring her for like on the bad days. Does that make sense? When in reality, like honor is like, I see you for the sum of who you are, and I'm going to treat you like you're on your best day. Because that's what we all need too. When I'm having a bad day, I don't need someone to treat me like I'm having a bad day and it's impacting them because I'm having a bad day. Yeah. I need somebody to believe in me and go like, Jesse, I see you on your bad day. And I actually value that. And I know you're walking through a lot. That helps me actually be better.
That's so big, man. I feel like there's a freedom in that too, as you're saying that. Not only is there I think, capability in modeling that and willing to step into that is a great picture to image Jesus to the world. That's the type of stuff that I feel like in maybe professional environments where you go, that person honors people so well. What's different about them? Not only think that's a great, way to actually show who Jesus is, But I think it's a way that we, again, coming back to this point, we step into leadership where we look at it and go, and again, I'm not a woman. I'm not going to say that I know what it's like. I do think having my wife, having a younger sister I was really close to growing up, dude, it's gross the amount of pressure women are under to be something on the surface in our culture.
Sure.
And if we want to be men that are leading them like Jesus would lead them, what I hear you saying is like, honor them on their good days for sure, especially on the days when it's bad.
Yep.
And they are not living up to this unrealistic, superficial image of what it means to be a woman. You see them and you honor them. Man, that's loving like Jesus.
Dude, you nailed it.
Is honoring like that. That's what I'm just taking away so much. It's honoring somebody, like you said, when either they don't deserve honor or they don't feel like they're worthy of honor in that moment. And it's showing them honor.
Christian,
I think that's so huge, man. Okay. So coming from that conversation, coming from honor, all these different things, if we could just maybe get a little bit more practical here. I think a big thing that I've always really respected about you, and you've mentioned a few times, man, you've always got the book, the podcast, like you are constantly looking to grow in leadership from a heart and skill perspective. I don't know if there's anything else you would maybe want to share in terms of habits. I know for me, habits are so huge that my intentions are always really, really good to be something, to grow in my leadership, to be a better husband, a better boy, whatever. And then my habits, oftentimes I'm like, I don't even know how to get there.
Sure.
I think I'm more of maybe a practical level. Is anyone who's listening, maybe resonating with so much of this, what are maybe some habits, some things that you would really encourage young adults to lean into, and maybe even men specifically, as we're saying, hey, let's step up and go first.
Sure.
What are some habits you would really want to impress on young men to say, hey, start doing these things because this will make you a better leader?
Yeah, I think I got a few. One of them, I would say, fill up your plate when it comes to like your responsibility. Again, leadership is willingly accepting responsibility. Part of our culture, you hear a lot about, like Cal Newport writes about, I don't know if he's essentialism or who that might be McCone, but it's like, just do what only you can do. And I think that is good advice at some point. But at the same time, when you're a young leader and you're starting out, two things. Number one, you don't know what you're uniquely good at. That actually you could be uniquely paid to do. You don't know what that thing is, so you got to figure it out. So take on more than you're responsible for. Take on more and work the long hours. The last thing that I want is somebody getting out of balance, but at the same time, like when you're a young adult, you're preparing for more responsibility down the road. And it's kind of like, I think in the Old Testament, it says, if you're getting stressed out right now, just running on foot, how do you expect to run with horses? And there's this idea of like, how do you expect to do this kind of a job and have kids and have a wife and have more responsibility at work? And so I think when you're young, it is trying to take on as much responsibility as you can, even overflow the plate. It's going to do a couple things. Number one, it's going to grow your capacity so that you can actually, when you're younger, grow the plate to where, man, I used to only be able to fit a couple things on it. Now I can fit more on it. Second, what happens is you figure out like, what are the things that actually the priorities that need to stay on the plate? And what are these things that I thought were important, but they're actually not important, that can fall off the plate? Because that's an important part of leadership and responsibility as you grow within your career, is figuring out like, what are the things that I have to do and what are the things that I think I have to do, but I actually don't have to do. And so you figure out what needs to stay on the plate. And then you figure out like, okay, what is the meat and potatoes of that plate? Like, what is the thing that Christian is uniquely good at? But you can't do that. You can't figure that out without a ton of experience, a ton of time, and really a lot of input and feedback there as well. And so those are the things where, quite frankly, when you're young, like I thought I had a leadership and teaching gift when I was 23 and I wanted to foster it. Nobody would have paid me to just lead or to just teach, because like a skill set actually is having some skills, but then also having the experience that you've put them through years and years and years of training so that you actually have an established skill set. So I think early on, the more that you do, you're going to expand your capacity so that you're ready for more later. You're also going to figure out what's your unique contribution. I also think you have to get really good at asking for feedback. So
I suck at that.
Like you have to learn to love feedback. and ask for it regularly. And again, this is not going to like overcome any insecurities that you have or anything like that, but it is going to help you grow. And typically what I found is people who are afraid of feedback or people who just are learning how to ask for it. They'll be like, you'd come into my office, hey, Jesse, can you just give me some feedback? Where do I need to grow? And it's like, that's an intimidating thing for me. I like you, you know, like I want to have a good relationship. I'm going to be like, okay, I don't know which one of these is going to trigger him. So like, or it's hard to think of. And what I found the best way to ask for feedback is to, first of all, be a little bit self-aware to go, here's an area that I feel like I need to grow. This is not going well, or this is an area that I want to do better. So I'm identifying the area. The second thing is identify a specific example where the person I'm asking for feedback has seen me operating in that capacity. And so I'll give you a good example. When I was, Jim and I were in an argument one time, and I left the meeting, and I was just like, I do not like the way that I showed up in that meeting. And so I went and asked a mentor who was in the meeting with me, and I just said, hey, can you give me some feedback? Because that was not the way I want to show up in that meeting. I didn't think that I had a great posture. I didn't think I articulated myself. Can you give me some feedback? And he had feedback because he had seen it and because I gave him permission to speak into that area. And so I would tell like people, get open to listening to feedback, but then ask for specific feedback at the time. And then the last thing I'd tell young leaders is I would actually tell young leaders, at least early on, to focus on their weaknesses, not focus on their strengths.
Just unpack that, yeah.
Sports analogy, because, you know, why not?
We're here, dude. We've done it already. Let's keep it going.
Outside of Stephen Curry and maybe 2 or 3 other unbelievable three-point shooters, if you can shoot three-pointers but you can't play defense and you can't pass, can you play in the NBA? Absolutely not.
Yeah, outside of being Steph. No.
Outside of Steph and maybe a couple others.
Ray Allen,
so there are the people who are, and you just have to say like, man, I'm going to honor Steph Curry for being a generational talent. And there are some people in your field who they're just, quite frankly, they are earlier developed, they have a unique skill set, and they're able to do what most people aren't able to do. But for most of us, like, we have some strengths, but at the same time, the strengths aren't good enough to cover up for our weaknesses. And so we hear all of this, you need to work on your strengths, and that's important, but actually your weaknesses are becoming limitations of your strengths. And I had a friend of mine, Sam, who like is a dear friend. We spent years and years in the gym together, and Sam had this like, he's just the best person with people I've ever met, where he led some volunteers and he led some teams. And these volunteers, when his parents came to town, his volunteers wanted to meet his parents because they love Sam so much. They're like, we just want to get to know the people who know you. Like, it's just a ridiculous thing. And at the same time, Sam as a young leader was not organized. And and his volunteers were actually getting frustrated at him because he just wasn't sending out emails at the right time. They didn't have attachments, whatever that was, just some of these basic things. And so for Sam, his weaknesses were actually limiting his strengths because they're getting frustrated, even though they loved him. And so what Sam and I had to do is we had to focus on his weaknesses, not to get great. He's never going to be the most organized person, but at the same time, they need to just become not limitations for your strengths so that your strengths can shine through. So I would tell young leaders, you might not like working on organization. You might not like working on responding to emails in a timely manner, whatever that looks like. But right now they're limiting people's leadership. They're limiting their strengths. So work on and focus on your weaknesses to just get them passable so that your strengths can shine.
So good. You actually said that to me a couple of years ago, and it's something that stuck with me. Is because I think sometimes I at least feel the pressure to make my weaknesses strengths.
Sure.
But I love what you're saying in that, where it almost puts your weaknesses in a different category, where you're not saying don't call them weaknesses.
Sure.
You're not having to admit you're good at everything, but get those weaknesses to a point where they are not limiting your strengths, because your strengths can flourish. 'Cause that's where we all want to live, is within our strengths.
Right.
But I love that take on it, because it's saying we're not going to call our weaknesses not weaknesses anymore. We're still going to admit we're not good at them,
Yep.
but we're going to work on them enough to make sure they don't actually hinder the stuff that we're really good at and that we want to do. I love that, man. So conversely on that, are there any habits or things that you see maybe right now, young adults who are stepping into leadership or in any realm of being a leader? Because to an extent, we are all called to lead. Are there things you would ask or say, hey, I would really, really encourage you to avoid these things? Are there pitfalls or habits or things that you see where, hey, this is a mistake that I made or I see people make, that you would really want to lean into people and say, hey, avoid these things because they can hinder your leadership?
Avoid skipping out on character. Like it is not going to get you the job, but it's going to keep you the job. It's not going to like make your career, but it can cost you your career. And it's this thing that just like work on your character, get involved with what you all are doing, read your Bible, develop what God's put inside you, because otherwise it's just going to cap you long term. Maybe not immediately, but maybe not immediately, but long term, because the more responsibility, the more leadership you get, the more responsibility you get, the more responsibility you get, the more pressure there is. And pressure is the thing that's actually going to squeeze out what's inside of you. And if you don't have character to squeeze out, like then all that nasty stuff that's inside you is going to come out on other people. And so I would say character is a huge thing. I'd say, again, going back to honor, avoid dishonor as much as you can, like treat people with honor. Avoid thinking that it's going to be easier when you have a certain title or position or any, like, it's just like, and that's one of the things, like, I remember every role, going back to that story with that leader who said, this is hard. Like, I remember going back to every role that I jumped into, I'd just be like, this is harder than I thought. And I felt so much more empathy for that guy going, oh, if that's how I felt, he had to feel worse. And I think about, like, for instance, Jim, like leading our organization every weekend, steps up there and is telling people, like, as best that he can discern after prayer and study, this is what God's telling us from his word, like the pressure that comes with that. And so, like, I would say avoid thinking that it'll all be better. And then honestly, I would tell people to avoid leadership unless they really care about people. Like if you just
unpack that. What do you mean?
If you just want to make decisions, then like be a solopreneur. Does that make sense? Like do your own thing, but like don't try to lead people, because honestly, like all of us are going to work roughly 90,000 hours in our life. And I believe that the leader is the leader is the difference between those being 90,000 net negative lives that you have to go home and recover from or go on vacation to recover from, or 90,000 net positive hours where you're like, man, I have meaning, I have purpose, I enjoy the people I work with, I enjoy the person I work for, and work actually most days fills me with life. That so much has to do with the leader. And so don't become a leader if you don't want to see that happen in other people. So that's what I would say.
Wow, that's powerful, man. I mean, Jesse, there's so much more we could talk about, but just for sake of time, I think we're going to wrap up here soon. As we kind of close this conversation, I want to reiterate one thing where I think so many of these principles, as we're listening, can apply to so many different areas of life.
Sure.
Whether it's professionally, relationally, all these things. I think as I'm hearing this, my first initial thought is to take this from a professional aspect and professional standpoint, but then I start filtering it through, man, if I were to live this as a husband, as a friend, this actually is how I grow in leadership in all areas of my life. And so as we kind of close out, man, I just want to give you a few minutes, if you have anything to share, just, hey, if you were sitting in a room full of young adult leaders, maybe even just, you're thinking of the young men that you see in this church, what's maybe the last bit of encouragement or thing you'd want to impress upon them and leave them with?
I would say leadership is a sacred responsibility. And you want to make sure that you're leveraging the time that you spend on the most important people. And so that's why I do believe our family, if you're not leading your family, whether it's a girlfriend, like whether you're married, eventually you have kids, it is so easy to show up as a quote unquote great leader at work to the detriment of your family. And so leadership is a sacred responsibility. Invest in your family. Invest in your wife, but also the sacred responsibility when you're in the marketplace, when you have one person who's working for you, when you're just working for someone else, think through like, okay, God actually entrusted this job, this position, this responsibility to me right now. And it's a sacred responsibility. And like, I really do believe that people see Jesus through their leaders. If you think about the Old Testament, do you know what they called the leaders in the Old Testament? They called them shepherds. So like through Isaiah, they're talking about shepherds. And then Jesus comes as the good shepherd, as almost to say like, I'm going to give you a picture of what leaders were supposed to show you by being the good shepherd. And so I believe that leaders have a way to be able to show people what Jesus looks like both at work, but then also in relationships, also at home. And I think that that's something that we all need to step into and to take that responsibility to say, this is sacred. I want to show you Jesus, and I want to lead you the way that Jesus would have led you. I want to interact with you the way that Jesus would have interacted with you. And again, it's hard. And it's supposed to be. And that's a really good thing. And sometimes I think our culture tells us avoid hard things and try to optimize everything so it's so easy. It's like leading yourself, leading the most important people to you, leading at work is difficult, but it's a sacred responsibility.
I love that, man. Wow. That could go on a t-shirt right there. Leadership is a sacred
Probably
responsibility.
Not, you know?
No, right.
So,
Jesse, thanks so much, man, for coming on. We'd love to have you on in the future, and we appreciate it, man.
dude, love it. Love what you guys are doing, and heart goes out for all the young adults. I hope that they lead better than I led when I was their age. I'll tell you that much.
We're trying.
Man.
We'll try.
Love
all right.
it.
Thanks again, man.